Hey, all, I was just on the Smarter Online Safety podcast speaking with Jocelyn, and we went into things like the impact of artificial intelligence on cybersecurity, as well as cybercrime. We went into some actionable tips for both businesses and individuals and talked about how you can avoid being the victim of an AI powered scam.
Welcome, everyone, to the Smarter Online Safety Podcast. I'm your host, Jocelyn King, and I am so excited today because I'm getting to bring such an amazing cybersecurity and AI expert into the conversation here. Walter Haydock. He is recognized in both the private sector and the public sector, and he's founder and chief executive officer of StackAware, which helps organizations manage their cybersecurity compliance and their privacy risk, especially from AI systems, while harnessing their benefits. He was previously a director of product management at Privacera, a data governance startup backed by Excel, as well as PTC, where he helped to secure the company's IoT product lines. And before entering the private sector, he served as a professional staff member for the Homeland Security Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, as an analyst of the National Counterterrorism Center, and as a reconnaissance and intelligence officer in the Marine Corps, and served in Afghanistan. So thank you for your service, Walter. And you're also a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and Harvard Business School. Not a bad resume. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Jocelyn. I appreciate it.
That's so great. Now you helped AI powered companies with their cybersecurity risks and cybersecurity. And our audience, I mean, one of the questions we get a lot is the concern about, everybody has this kind of floating anxiety about, well, with AI being adopted, what are the risks or the things that could happen to them as a customer or consumer? So I'd just love to start with, where do you see the biggest gaps? Because you're helping the companies that are forward-looking and early adopters, but there's a ton of companies that aren't really thinking through the security for their AI, deployments and things. And what are the biggest risks that you see, especially as how it's going to affect customers and consumers?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that, Jocelyn. So I would map AI and security into three separate buckets.
Okay.
There would be AI for security, which is
Mm,
probably the oldest use of the technology, and a lot of people are familiar with it, although maybe not actively so. Things like fraud prevention on your credit card, that's using machine learning to identify fraud and block it. So that's kind of the first category. There are more advanced ways of using it, like AI for security operations at the enterprise level. The next thing to consider would be what I call AI for hacking. So hacking to me is a neutral term. It could be ethical hacking, it could be penetration testing, or it could be cybercrime, phishing. It could be exploitation of vulnerabilities to deliver ransomware, things like that. And the proliferation of AI tools has made AI for hacking accessible to basically everyone and has empowered a lot of malicious actors to accelerate their campaigns. And then
mhm.
the final piece would be security for AI, and that's where I primarily work. There is some overlap between the other pieces of the puzzle, but security for AI is ensuring that when you are deploying AI systems, either at the individual or at the enterprise level, you're doing so in a secure and compliant manner. So, are you managing the risks of things like unintended training? Are you managing your supply chain? Are you complying with the evolving regulatory landscape? These are all things that I include in security for AI. So that's my overview. Happy to drill down into any of those.
Well, it's great. If anybody Googles unintended training and AI, your name is going to pop up in the top because you are a recognized expert in it and you've spoken so eloquently and so well about it. Can you explain to people what that is?
Sure. Unintended training occurs whenever someone provides information to an AI system that trains on that data, and then in the light of day after the fact, the person providing that information probably wouldn't have wanted the AI system to have trained on that.
Hmm.
An example of this is in late 2022, early 2023, according to press reporting, Amazon engineers were heavily using ChatGPT, providing it with access to internal architecture, their code base, things like that. And then separate Amazon engineers went back to ChatGPT, trying to use it to help prepare them to give engineering interviews. And ChatGPT performed well, so well, in fact, that the people preparing for the interviews thought that it had some sort of inside information. And it very well may have,
Hmm.
because it was probably training on these inputs from Amazon engineers in a different context. So that's an example of unintended training right there.
That's great. So things like ChatGPT or large AI systems that are looking at pretty much all the known internet information versus closed systems like in medical AI systems where they're only feeding it journal reviewed findings and things like that. Can you explain the difference between those? Because unintended consequences can happen in either one, correct? But could you just explain for people who are still grokking how AI, why AI systems are different and, what their core information base is? Could you explain that for the layperson?
Yeah, and now that you mention it, Jocelyn, the term unintended training could have a potential additional meaning from what I am saying, but you raise a very good point. So, when I'm talking about unintended training, primarily, I'm talking about it primarily from a confidentiality perspective,
Okay.
meaning that if you provide information to ChatGPT, if you just go to chatgpt.com and don't log in and start typing information, ChatGPT is going to be training on that data. So it could be reproduced to people who don't have a need to know that information if you provided anything sensitive. There are ways to mitigate that risk. You can opt out of training, use a paid version under certain circumstances and plans. So that's the first set of circumstances. The
Okay.
second set of circumstances, which you raise, which is equally valid, is more from a data integrity perspective, meaning that you potentially could corrupt an AI model by training it on data that you didn't want to train it on, or maybe you didn't know that that information was incorrect. So that's more of an data integrity issue, and something that OpenAI, I'm sure they have thought of this pretty in depth is, someone who's malicious could simply provide lots of seemingly accurate information to ChatGPT, knowing that it's training on that data, but in fact it's incorrect, and that could throw off the model after the fact.
Okay. That's great. Thank you for that. And and we were talking about, the unintended training, and it's just such a fascinating topic. And you're heavily involved in ethics as well in all of this in cybersecurity and AI. Another area that touches on, the interface and unintended consequences, as well as just ways that AI is going to be changing our lives. You also have a lot of expertise in NHIs or non-human interfaces. And while technically that term broadly used, could be applied to things that have been around for a while, obviously AI is increasing and we're getting into non-human interfaces that look human and things. Could you talk about that? Because in security circles, there's a lot, and government circles, there's a lot of concerns about them, and it's just starting to get into more public awareness and discussion. Could you talk about NHIs and especially what the benefits and risks are, especially around the cybersecurity risks?
Sure. So I've made a couple posts and public statements about NHIs. I use the term non-human identity. That's the term I'm familiar with, but it could be non-human interface as well. So in my opinion, non-human interfaces, excuse me, in my opinion, non-human identities, the term is unfortunately a little bit dangerous because it implies that there is someone aside from a human who is accountable for the actions of a given system. And what I propose is that organizations should treat artificial intelligence systems and agents just like they do any other asset, where there's a data owner who's accountable for the actions of the system and the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information contained therein. And not use the term NHI, simply refer to it what it is as what it is. Because if you use the term NHI, that implies some sort of inability to influence or control its outcomes, which I think can reduce or attenuate the accountability that individuals or organizations feel toward those systems.
Okay. So for people who are trying to visualize it too, like for instance, everybody's familiar with chatbots, and going on a website and have a chatbot, but an NHI being something that's human looking, you even see them in museums and stuff now where it's interacting with you and things like that. But could you, how are people most likely to encounter an NHI, a non-human identity, in the course of, a day or living their life somehow?
So the example of chatbots is quite apropos, and I'll give an example. So a year or two ago, a gentleman in Canada asked an Air Canada chatbot about the refund policy for a ticket he had bought and was given an answer that implied he could be refunded. When he went to make good on this request, Air Canada told him that no, in fact, the chatbot was mistaken and that he had to pay the full price that he had signed up for. He took Air Canada to court, and a judge ruled in his favor, saying that Air Canada could not remove itself from accountability of the outputs of the chatbot, even though it was wrong and it was likely a hallucination. So, the key thing to understand from an individual consumer perspective is that you may be interacting with a system, you may or may not know that it is an artificial intelligence model or system that you're talking to, and it can provide you with incorrect information. And then on the flip side, organizations that are putting these out there cannot absolve themselves of accountability for the outputs of these systems.
That's interesting. So it's very similar to having employees, human employees, and you train them and they're responsible, for doing a good job of knowing the information. But if they give misinformation on the phone because they're acting as an agent of the company is still responsible
Hmm.
for their output, and that's up to the company to resolve. So it's So that's interesting. We're seeing legal precedent being set that NHIs, even if they're just like humans, thinking too far outside the box and coming up with their own, and having their, hallucinations where they're giving misinformation. The courts so far are viewing it the same as if an employee went off track and gave misinformation.
At least in this specific case in Canada, yes.
Okay, that's interesting. That'll be very interesting to follow and see what happens, because I'm sure that's the other thing is all of the AI related things that are going to be filling the courts is, it's something that's another topic for another time. That's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. AI is such a loaded topic, and especially around safety and security. I get to speak with really, smart experts like yourself and everyday people who, don't know even the basics of some things on their smartphone. And it kind of doesn't, the amount of fear that people have about what AI can do and the amount of, hope and optimism of what AI can do is widespread in all parts of that spectrum. And I would just love to hear what's your perspective on the upsides of AI and the risks, and the things we've got to keep an eye on or that are concerning. I'd love to see your view because you have such in-depth knowledge in cybersecurity and AI and seeing what goes well and what is not and what is really a risky business.
As far as AI goes, I'm pro AI. I am definitely not a doomer by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it has the potential to really unlock a lot of human creativity, to alleviate suffering, drudgery, things like that. And overall, I'm firmly in the pro camp. With that said, that doesn't mean we can go willy-nilly and just unleash it without any sort of guardrails in place. So
Mhm.
that's where I come into play, and that's where StackAware, my company, works, is helping organizations leverage artificial intelligence in a responsible way by putting the right guardrails in place. So, in general, I am relatively libertarian in terms of my views on regulation. I have some sympathy for, having a light touch when it comes to regulating artificial intelligence systems. Interestingly enough, my company makes money by helping companies guide them through the process of
Right.
regulatory compliance. But, I think the best thing for the country and the economy is to take a lighter touch with respect to regulation. So that's my approach. That's my perspective. But whatever the laws or regulations or standards are, I'm going to be here to help people comply with them.
That's really great. Well, and you have such a well-rounded perspective because you've been in military, you've been in government related to regulatory, and you're in private sector as a startup, and you work with large companies in, corporate private sector. What given that you can see you can see all sides of, everybody coming to the table, you understand, the constraints and the needs of all parties. How do you think policymakers should be balancing public safety and personal privacy in today's digital world with everything that's going on? Where do you mentioned libertarian, so light touch, but so not heavy-handed, but not hands off either. What would you like to see happen?
I could definitely see in the United States at the federal level a nationwide bill that covers cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence governance.
Mhm.
So there's been discussion at the federal level of a data privacy bill that would preempt the 50 plus, state and municipality level laws that we have. And I think from a business perspective, that would be quite helpful to get some clarity and not have to apply a bunch of different rules in every single jurisdiction. Obviously, I respect that, we are a country made up of states that have their own individual sovereignty, but I think in the digital age, we need to have a unified data privacy and AI governance law. On the latter side of things, we're seeing now individual states like Colorado, Virginia tried to pass one, didn't. Texas potentially passing their own AI governance bills.
Mm.
And these are going to create such a huge burden for companies that I really think it makes sense at the federal level to have Congress step in and preempt the state laws, just so we have a consolidated regulatory framework in the country.
Right, right. Because companies that do business across all 50 states, especially when they're virtual, uh, it would be very constrictive for them and burdensome, to your point, for them to be able to do the services they're doing if they had to comply with 26 enacted states and try to help govern cybersecurity in the 24 that haven't yet passed regulation or whatever it is, something like that. That is a really excellent point. So pro national level with guidelines that so companies need to be accountable, especially to their consumers and customers, but not so heavy-handed that everybody's tied up in legal red tape.
Yeah, and on the light touch side of things, an important point that a lot of people understand in the backs of their minds but don't really say out loud is
Mhm.
this. If you regulate heavily enough, for example, take employment.
Mhm.
If you regulate heavily enough in your state or even your city, for example, New York City has an HR specific AI law that requires that you apply certain steps to your system if it qualifies as an automated employment decision tool.
Oh,
Now,
interesting.
if you take that to its logical extreme and make it basically impossible for employers to operate in your jurisdiction, you know what they're going to do? They're just not going to hire there.
Right.
So we need to be very careful in threading that eye hole or that keyhole and making sure that in the United States, we're not creating this regulatory swamp where it's impossible to do business because then international companies are just going to say, okay, we're not going to do that. And frankly, we're already seeing that in Europe. If you look at the GDP growth of the United States versus Europe over the past 10 years, the US has been pulling ahead by a lot. And there's been a huge amount of regulation in Europe over that same time period. Hard to tell if it's causation or correlation, but I think
Mhm.
there is some causation there.
Right. Well, and I grew up in California, reside most of the time in California, and there's a lot of companies that I've worked for and worked with who have, moved headquarters even from California to Texas or Tennessee or Nevada or other more regulatory friendly states. So there's a lot of that we've already seen, here. And then when you add AI and cybersecurity regulations to it, it would just be compounding the problem. So that's a really important thing. The companies that you're helping are the early adopters, or at least the ones who are really wanting, the good governance. They want to do everything right. I mean, all of us over, the age of 25 or 30 can remember things like during like how cybersecurity and things become an afterthought. Security and safety and certain disciplines become only needed when there's an emergency. Like remember during COVID lockdown and Zoom, all the meeting bombings that were going on with people jumping into meetings they shouldn't be in and stuff. And then Zoom had to step up its security measures, and everybody remembers what's happened on Facebook and other social media. And so there's a real difference between companies that are looking at cybersecurity being part of their implementation, such as, okay, we're implementing AI and let's do it in a thoughtful, disciplined way, and others who are just trying to adopt AI as quickly as possible and are going to have something happen later that's going to make them step it up. You're right at the forefront of that because you know what you're helping that your customers achieve. What's the biggest risks that are happening out there with companies that are adopting AI without thinking about security and processes and best practices and all of that? And what does it mean to consumers?
The biggest risk I see in the marketplace right now is companies that don't even understand that there is a risk to be addressed.
Oh, wow. Okay. Lack of, they don't know what they don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
StackAware's customers are basically by definition in the top 10% of sophistication when it comes to using and governing AI, because only at that level are folks even starting to think that, oh, I understand that this could be a potential issue. I should engage a specialist. And those are the types of folks that I find myself working with.
Right.
The ones that don't even have a clue, so to speak, they're not really interested in talking to me because they don't see a problem at this point. So that's the biggest challenge is really just an awareness perspective. And that's why I appreciate having conversations with people like you.
That's awesome. We have a lot of consumers who listen to us, and a lot of them are uh, work in small businesses or own small businesses or solopreneurs. And we have a lot of people who work in Fortune 100 companies. And then, of course, everybody has their own digital life and devices and everything. So I'm going to ask you for three pieces of advice. One would be for business leaders of companies, mid-size and large companies, of what they should be doing and thinking about online safety, especially as they're deploying, AI. A piece of advice for the solopreneur and small business owner who's so busy trying to just keep their business going and grow their business that they're not even thinking about cybersecurity and online safety. And then the last one would be for consumers. And so we can dig into this as much as you want, but those are, and I'm sure there's some interrelated things here, but what is with your vantage point, and you have such rich expertise and you get to see inside companies where you're deploying, and you get to see the actual engine of and working with the best of the best who are implementing good practices. For companies that are obviously every company is thinking about what do we do with AI, what advice from a AI tech and safety and cybersecurity perspective would you offer to those business leaders about what they need to do and how they need to think about their AI deployments?
At an enterprise level, the first thing a business should do when it comes to AI governance is establishing a clear policy. That doesn't need to be called the AI policy. It can be incorporated into other policies, but it's important to have clear guidance about which systems you can use, what data classifications you can use, and then also any other regulatory concerns that might crop up from employing systems in certain contexts like human resources. So that's the key top recommendation I would make for enterprises that are looking at deploying AI. And if you think you're not deploying I would check again.
You're deploying it whether you know it or not.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
great. That's great advice. And obviously, those are the kinds of companies that you work with, and
Right.
we'll give your information at the end too. And for small businesses and solopreneurs and people, and that affects all of us as consumers because no matter who you are, you're working with a small business somewhere, a veterinarian or your tax preparer or somebody could be, as a small business, and they've got your information and things like that too. So a lot of small business owners really don't even think about cybersecurity, or they think, oh, I've installed Norton Utilities, so I'm okay, or something. What advice do you have for them so that they don't become one of the 66% that go out of business 6 months after a cyber incident because they can't survive? How can they protect themselves and the data and their business and their customers?
I'm sure that a lot of guests come on your show and say the exact same thing, but I'm just going to say it again. Two-factor authentication.
Okay.
Just ensure that you have two-factor authentication in place because, if you look at the statistics of hacks on any system between those who have 2FA enabled and those that don't, like it's just obvious that it makes it much harder to get into your systems if you have two-factor authentication enabled. So just turn it
That's
on.
awesome. Well, and that's great. And I don't think you can say it too many times because the rule of thumb is you have to hear something 7 times before you even lands anyway. And the other thing is when all the experts say the same thing, or 90% of them are saying the same thing over and over, it does reinforce that this is foundational. This is not something to skip. So that is awesome. Thank you for that. And then for consumers, I'm sure two-factor authentication for consumers too, but what else, for most consumers do not have, strong tech backgrounds. They don't work in cybersecurity. They don't get the benefit of daily access to people like you and some of the other guests we have. What what advice do you have for them, particularly in this time of AI, where there's just so much heightened fear about what it means? What could they do to help at least reassure themselves?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to reassure people, but I'll
Fair enough.
tell them, I'll give them some actionable advice on what they can do is things are already accelerating right now in terms of the ability to deep fake photos, videos, voice, the ability to clone the appearance, the voice of a loved one is really going to throw a lot of people for a loop. And having a some sort of passphrase or security phrase that you and your loved ones only and is not written down anywhere. That is a key way to be able to verify someone's identity. If you get a phone call from your child saying that he or she's been kidnapped and that there's a ransom, or an elder parent gets some sort of voicemail or email impersonating you and using the same tone, using the same voice, these types of things are really going to throw people for a loop. So being extra skeptical about all the inputs that you receive, especially in the digital world, is going to be really important for consumers.
That's really important. So a passphrase so that you're going to ask them a question, they need to say it, and it can't be a question that somebody could discern from the social media post of your
Right.
trip to Disneyland or something like that. It has to be
Not your
something.
mother's middle name, or
Right,
mother's maiden name. Don't do that.
right,
That's not a good one.
right.
It's, something that only you and your spouse or only you and your child would know.
Okay. And not connected to your favorite movie or anything
No.
else that is discernible from any
Yeah.
security question or
Right.
anything you've ever posted. So that's great.
Yeah.
And then you need to ask for that. We did have a guest on who was talking about the Ferrari deep fake and the CEO who on the phone who had contacted the CFO and was talking about you had to wire these millions of dollars over. And they didn't have a preset passphrase, but the CFO did have his wits about him and said, sir, yes, I'm happy to do this. Yesterday I was in your office and you recommended a book for me to read. What was the name of that book?
Mm.
So it's that model that you're talking about, but that you have a passphrase and you need to have it. And by the way, that's been a best practice from kidnappings for a long time too, is having a question that you're going to ask to make sure that they're still have not been harmed and that it really is
Right,
them.
right,
Mhm.
right.
This is happening a lot more. People who are writing into us, especially, a lot of elderly retired people get targeted, of course, for their money. And in the past, there's been cyber criminals calling in with their own voices saying it's Eddie or Sally or whomever. But now it's actually they'll be able to almost identically mimic that voice, and it's going to be almost indiscernible. So this is an important thing, not just that people need to do across their whole family, including generational, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. More and more seniors are losing their retirements, and then that is also affecting their adult children who think, okay, we're saving for the kids' college, but now all of a sudden their parents no longer have their retirement because it was they withdrew it and gave it to bad guys unintentionally. And now you've got to take care of parents with no money and think about your children's education and keep working your job. And more people are starting to fall into that. And that is a big concern. And I want to highlight that. So your advice, I'm saying this so that everybody listening today will have a conversation. We'll have a meeting, a family meeting to say, we're going to come up with this and we need to all be clear on this, and we're not writing it down anywhere, and we're not telling our friends at school or anything, but that we need
Absolutely.
to do this to protect ourselves. Um, do you have a sense? I mean, the thing about escalation, right? AI is escalating everything. It's also escalating cybercrime. And we're seeing people that were bad hackers who would have typos and things and bad faked websites suddenly have these tools that make them great hackers. With websites that really do look like the DMV or really do look like the IRS. They're able to mimic it so well, and the voices they don't have foreign accents anymore. They sound like an American working in a bank, things like that. Just how do you recommend people be vigilant without being paranoid? I know that's a very deep question, but what advice do you have for how people should have a different posture in their life, maybe than they've had up until now, because there are greater threats?
Yeah, AI has definitely accelerated the ability of cyber criminals to be more believable. Although I'll frankly say the phishing emails I get are still pretty bad. They're still pretty bad.
Yes.
I I kind of just want to say, you know, come on, man, could you at least run this through ChatGPT? Like it doesn't sound reasonable, based on what I know. But with that said, it's going to get better, and cyber criminals are going to get more savvy, and the really good ones are going to get better and get more money, and the really bad ones are going to get caught and thrown in jail, which is good. And so the ones that are super savvy are the ones you need to watch out for. And I would say just apply a certain degree of scrutiny to all the inputs that you're receiving. And this isn't just like a fraud, cybercrime concern. It's also more of a just general critical thinking, societal impact. There's been a lot of talk about AI generated deepfakes, not necessarily directly causing or being used in fraud, but manipulating public opinion. And I think people should recalibrate their brains to understand that simply because there's a certain array of pixels that you see on a screen doesn't necessarily mean anything. And
Right.
the AI generated videos, the deepfake photos are getting so good that I wouldn't put a lot of stock in the mere fact that there are a certain set of pixels on your screen.
Okay. So really, instead of paying attention to whether it looks real or not, people should pay more attention to, are they asking me for something? Are they asking me for money? Are they asking me for personal information or last four of my, so anytime anybody's asking you for something, you've got to you've got to take a step back and really think, who am I giving this to? And are we on a communication channel that I want to be on doing this? Or should I be, if I think it really is my bank, I will go to my bank. If I think it really is Aunt Sally, I will get out of this chat and contact Aunt Sally, like take another means. So do you think that that kind of trigger is how we have to rewire our human intelligence in this age of artificial intelligence?
Absolutely at the, at the cybercrime defense level, but more broadly, just critical thinking, understanding like, why, like you said, why is this person calling me? Why am I being asked for this information? But also more broadly, like, what does it mean for this image to exist? What does it mean for me to receive this email? You know, Not simply just I joke that unfortunately our education system has turned some people into human computers where they just get an input and then they provide an output, and that sort of skill set is going to be less and less effective economically or viable economically as AI accelerates, but also just from a general kind of existing in society perspective, that's not you don't want to be able to be manipulated that easily. So being able to apply critical thinking to all the inputs that you receive is going to be a key skill going forward.
That is great advice. Thank you so much for that, Walter. And for people who want to know more about your company and how to reach you, particularly those in the enterprise level and stuff, how should they best contact you to learn more?
Yeah, the best way to get a hold of me is on LinkedIn. Just go to LinkedIn and look up Walter Haydock. I am the only one there right now. My father is not on LinkedIn, so you'll just get me. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about my company, you can also go to stackaware.com and see what we're about and also book a consultation through that site.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for your service in the military or from the government side and now in the private sector, you've been helping keep us all safe for a very long time. And we appreciate your efforts and your contribution to making the world better. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to come on the show.
That was great. Well, it was great discussion. I'm sure we're going to have some more follow-up questions and stuff. And one thing that happens a lot after we post these, some other questions come in. So I may be
Sure.
coming back, asking you to come back on to help answer some of
Sure.
those follow-ons, especially because you've got such great expertise with AI and cybersecurity and what a powerful combination that's so needed right now. So thank you for that. All right, everyone. So you learned a lot. Take his advice, treat everything with skepticism. And until next time, stay safe out there.